Okay, hello. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for attending in person today, and hello to all those people who are watching online or at some point in the future. So I'm delighted to introduce Professor Vera Troeger from Warwick University's Department of Economics. Professor Troeger kindly accepted the invitation extended by LSTM's Women in Global Health Group. The Women in Global Health Group at LSTM aims to create a more equitable and diverse place to work for all of us, to harness the exceptional talent that we have at LSTM and ultimately enable us to have a bigger impact in the work that we do. By inviting external speakers like Professor Troeger, we want to inspire all of us at LSTM to think differently about how we do things and the way we approach our work. Professor Troeger first came to our attention in a Guardian article where she was speaking about the challenges of Brexit on UK academia. She is a professor of quantitative political economy in the Department of Economics at Warwick University and a core investigator on the Centre for Competitive Advantage in the Global Economy. Vera is the founding editor-in-chief of the flagship European Political Science Association journal. She serves as associate editor for one of the most highly ranked journals in political science and serves on the editorial boards of the American Political Science Review, the European Journal of Political Research, and the European Journal of Public Policy. Her research interests lie at the intersection between international and comparative political economy, labour economics, quantitative data analysis, and political methodology. She studies the impact of parental leave policies on productivity, career development, and the gender pay gap. And, if that wasn't enough, she contributes to the field of quantitative political economy methodology. So, in her seminar today, thankfully, Vera is going to give us a little bit of an introduction about what all of these concepts and fields mean. I think, you know, for some of us they're quite new and I think exciting because I think they have real clear applications for the work that we do. But then she's going to give us a specific example of how those methods can be applied to a particular problem. So thank you very much and welcome.
Let me switch this on so you can hear me all. Thank you so much, Eve, for the kind words. Thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here to show you a little bit of my work and to talk to you about things I've been working on for maybe the last couple of years. So I got really interested in questions of gender equality in academia, but not just in academia, and especially things that can foster women's careers and reduce the gender pay gap, especially in academia. So as Eve said, I work in the field of political economy or quantitative political economy, which basically means that we are analyzing all things political, whether it's political decision-making, voting, voting behavior, decision-making in governments or committees, but also things like decision-making about policies and how policies affect outcomes. And I'm doing that by using large kind of data sets. So whether they are comparative in nature, so comparing policies across countries, for example, or individual in nature, where I look how policies affect individual behavior or how individual behavior and preferences are aggregated into policymaking. So what I want to do is I want to actually exemplify these kind of concepts that I'm working with this specific project. That's a very large research project that's funded by the ESRC and CAGE, the center I'm an investigator for. And it's a large project, joint work with Maria Elisa Epifanio, who's actually a lecturer here in the politics department in Liverpool, Tom Scotto at Strathclyde University, and my PhD student, Ricardo Di Leo. He's really, really, really good and did a lot of work collecting and analyzing the data. So what I really wanted to show you is how a specific policy that is enacted not just nationally by the government, but also changes and varies quite a bit across institutions, how this actually affects outcomes for women, specifically in UK academia. So why do I think this is interesting? Why do I think this is important? Because what we can observe empirically is that women who work full-time still earn, on average, about 15% less. So this is what we call the gender pay gap. This is the unconditional gender pay gap. We're just observing women and men in the same jobs, and women earn about 15% less. However, that is not so much the main issue, right? So in this country, we have the Equal Pay Act. So if you are actually doing the same job, you have to get the same amount of pay. But what happens really in the work life is that women do actually different jobs, right? So it's more like the gender, what we would call the gender job divide. So many less women are in senior jobs. When you just look across different countries, in the UK, France, Germany, and so on, 80 to 90% of executive jobs are occupied by men. Women usually select into jobs that are paid less, right? So caregiving jobs, like teaching, nursing, secretary jobs, and so on. However, what we also see from the data when we analyze the data is that women are at least as ambitious as men, because more than 50% of all university degrees are earned by women, right? But what actually happens is that women suffer from the so-called motherhood penalty, right? And we see this in the data, and that's why I'm interested in how we can actually overcome what we call the motherhood penalty. So this comes basically because, of course, women are expected to look after the children once they are born. And so most women actually scale back after maternity. So they reduce their hours, they go to less demanding jobs, and therefore they earn less. And I just saw an a piece in The Economist yesterday that actually showed which countries are the worst, right, in this respect. So Austria and Germany, for example, are really bad in the sense that 10 years after having a child, in Germany, mothers earn 60% less on average than if they hadn't had a child. And I think that's quite telling. In the UK, it's about 40%, right? But that's a huge gap, and that is really what is causing the so-called gender gap in pay. So the problem really is, of course, there's a lot that we can observe in terms of earnings and so on. But it's also about career progression, right? So I'm working with a lot of charities in this country who try to help women going back into jobs once they had children. And what we learn here from a lot of case studies is that when women go back after they had children, they are actually quite often overlooked when it comes to promotions, when it comes to opportunities for having a better paying or more challenging job, because it's still kind of this unconscious bias there that women need to look after the children. However, what we also can observe is, of course, a dramatic evolution since the 60s, right? In the 60s, in most Western countries, women were just expected to stay home and quit their job after having children, and at least look after the children until they are in school or even further. Hopefully, in the 2010s, so more recently, there is a consensus that working mothers are important. We need to support them. We need diversity is a good per se, right? So we need women in the workplace. So I did a lot of interviews when I started this research with HR officials from companies, not just universities. So for example, one thing stuck with me. Companies like BMW or Jaguar Land Rover offer mothers 12 months of full salary replacement without any prior conditions, because they say in our design teams, we want to have diversity. And what we see is that those teams that are diverse, where you have women and men in, that they produce better outcomes, right? And that's why they are trying to keep women in the labor market by offering better maternity benefits. So in the UK, the length of reinstatement, the right to reinstatement, so the right to get your job back that you left because you had a child, was doubled in 2007 from 26 weeks to 52 weeks, so 1 year. However, maternity pay is still conditional on continuous employment before childbirth, and the generosity of the statutory entitlements are very, very low in comparison. So this is just OECD data that basically shows you what is the length of maternity leave that is statutory, legally granted to women. And what you can see here, the red bar is the UK there. In terms of length, so 52 weeks, the UK is relatively close to the OECD average, which is fine, I guess. However, what is really, really surprising, or not so much surprising as maybe a real problem here, is that the generosity of maternity pay, when we look at the UK, is very low in comparison, right? When we just look at EU countries, the generosity of maternity pay in the UK, as measured as full salary replacement during the weeks after childbirth, is only undercut by Ireland, right? So most countries in the EU pay more generous maternity benefits. Also, again in comparison, when we just look at how much public money is spent on each newborn child, right, then we see again that the generosity of this pay is very low in comparison in the UK. It's only undercut by Greece and the Netherlands in the EU, right? So why am I showing you this? Because it looks like there's room for improvement, right? So now we want to know whether we should improve this, right? What are the benefits of improving this for women in the workplace? So what we know from the literature is that maternity leaves come with benefits and costs for women in the workplace. What some of the papers that are cited here have found is that high replacement rates, so relatively high salary replacement during maternity, is very beneficial for mothers to stay connected to the workplace. However, very long leaves, and that kind of makes sense, depreciates human capital and therefore earnings capacity for women. However, what means long, so there is kind of a sweet spot, right? So the literature shows that about 52 weeks is a good length maternity leave. Everything that is longer will reduce earnings capacity. And of course, it's also the case that more frequent breaks from work will reduce your earnings and career opportunities afterwards. So when we just look at the data very roughly, without doing any kind of, sophisticated data analysis, what we find is there's indeed this relationship I just described from the literature, right? That when you look at the effect or the relationship between the length of maternity leave and the gender pay gap, then you have this positive relationship, right? So that means that countries that offer very long maternity leaves have also a larger gender pay gap, right? On the other hand, generosity, so high replacement rates, reduce the gender pay gap, right? So this is kind of not well identified. This is just correlations. This is just to kind of illustrate the point that I was making before. I show you much more fine-grained data that will support this point. So, as I said, the legal entitlements in the UK are relatively ungenerous. So, women who have been in work with the same employer for 26 weeks, so 6 months, before the 15th week of expected childbirth and have earned at least £109 a week before are entitled to statutory maternity pay, which grants 90% of your last salary for 6 weeks, for the first 6 weeks. And then a flat rate for 33 weeks and another, I think, what is it? Let me just, 12 weeks, 13 weeks of unpaid maternity leave, right? So, so this flat rate of £140 is, of course, very, very low, right? So what happens in this country, and that's what is very exciting to me as a researcher, is because statutory entitlements, legal entitlements, are so ungenerous in this country, most institutions, universities, but also companies and so on, top up this ungenerous statutory maternity pay by so-called occupational maternity pay, right? And it's interesting that there is a lot of variation that we can observe, not just over time, but also across institutions. And we can exploit this type of variation to actually draw some conclusions on how additional, more generosity affects outcomes for women in the workplace. So as I said, higher education institutions in this country top up the statutory provisions. There's a lot of variability. What is really good about higher education institutions is actually that you can measure individual productivity. You might think it's not a very good measure, and it is, of course, different across disciplines and so on, but you, of course, can look at what individuals produce in terms of publications, in terms of other research outcomes. That is almost impossible to measure in any other sector, right? So we hope that if we can find effects on productivity in a high-skilled sector like academia, we might actually transfer these results to other high-skilled sectors. Of course, what we know is in academia, and you had a brilliant day, I guess, in gender equality yesterday, that women are underrepresented in most disciplines, and they have, on average, lower salaries, but also lower research outcomes and promotions, right? A lot of women try to strategically time the birth of children in academia, so not just within their careers, what I did, for example, I waited until I had tenure before I had a child. A lot of women do that. But also within the school year, right? So it's good to have a child in May because then the summer holidays kind of prolong the potential maternity leave. And what we also find is that we have this motherhood penalty also in academia. There's this leaking pipe problem once women try to progress up the career ladder. So what we did is we collected data on all the occupational maternity pay and maternity benefit schemes across all universities in the UK over time as well. And this is just a snapshot of current maternity leave provisions. So what you can see here is, as I said, there's huge variation, right? There's a few places that do not top up statutory maternity pay, right? So they just grant the 6 weeks of 90% and that's it. And we have up to, we have institutions that grant up to 26 weeks of full salary replacement, so 6 months of full salary replacement, and then everything in between. If you want to know what kind of institutions these are, here you have a few examples. Yeah, I put Liverpool in here as well. So Liverpool grants 8 weeks of full salary replacement. That's very similar to a lot of other universities, but down here you have Oxford, Manchester, Birkbeck College, Royal College of Arts, and so on. So, say again? Liverpool is in 16 weeks? LSTM, oh, okay. So you have a different, no, that's great to know. You have a different maternity scheme than the University of Liverpool. Okay, so, and it's more generous. That's also very good. So, right. So just to basically summarize, the data is there. So that is Higher Education Statistical Agency data on basically shares of females in these different categories. And this is exactly what I described before. So we can observe this leaking pipe problem, right? You still have almost 50% lecturers of all, across all disciplines that are women. And then that goes down to about 35% senior lecturers, so associate professors, senior lecturers, and so on. So tenured people, and then less than 20% full professors across all disciplines. That varies greatly. In economics, you have less than 10% on average full professors in economics. So that's the state of the affairs at the moment. And then you see exactly the same thing in terms of salaries. So you have a lot of women are in the lowest salary category, and then once you reach the highest salary category that is given by the Higher Education Statistical Agency, it's just larger than £56,000 here. You only have less than 30% of women in that category. Unfortunately, you don't have even higher categories, right? Once you get into the six-figure salaries, there's almost no women there anymore. So the literature tried to explain this phenomenon kind of away, right? So apparently, there are findings that women self-select into less publication-intense areas. I'm not sure what self-selection means, right? Everybody can draw their own conclusions. There is this loyal servant hypothesis that women have lower mobility and a much higher chance of turning down wage-increasing outside offers. That is usually due to either because their partners earn more, and so they have kind of this two-body problem, or they have child-rearing, family-rearing responsibilities and therefore are less mobile. So because of this, women on average have a lower propensity to move, and therefore lower promotion rates, higher exit patterns, and family dissolution patterns relative to men. So incidentally, when you look at fathers in academia, then having children from men actually has either no effect, but some papers even show that it has positive effects for the career path of men. However, what happens is that previous literature on this relationship of maternity leave and higher education only provides case studies for small samples, so you cannot really draw conclusions or inferences from this, or look at aggregate data. And there you usually have what is called ecological fallacy problem. So you cannot really draw conclusions from at the aggregate level on individual behavior, right? So that's why we are doing something very different here. So what we really want to know is whether the status of women academics has improved over the last 30 years. So we first started studying why these universities have so vastly different provisions, right? So I think that's a very interesting question in the first place to find out. But then we really want to know whether this has an effect on outcomes for women in academia. So I'm just showing you very quickly what we found in terms of why universities actually implement very different maternity benefits. So one of the major reasons is research intensity, right? So places that have a higher research intensity, so Russell Group universities, for example, Golden Triangle universities, and so on, seem to have a higher incentive to keep highly productive women in the workplace, and so they incentivize them with better maternity provisions. So that's kind of an on average finding. We find a lot of other things, so we are modeling this theoretically with what is called a bargaining model, where we model the bargaining between the women who will benefit from this policy and the university leadership, so the leadership in the organization, because of course very generous maternity benefits cost, right? And they cost in different ways. They cost, of course, a lot of money, but they cost also in terms of that you have to replace this person that is looking after students, teaching, and so on with somebody else when they are on maternity leave. So we are looking, for example, at the student-to-staff ratio at universities to see whether this makes a difference for the generosity of the benefits that are provided. So what we actually find is, on the bargaining side, that universities that previously, before the new policy was implemented, had a larger share of female professors also implement better policies. And also universities that have a larger share of female academics at child-rearing age have better maternity provisions. What we do not find is that the income of the institution has any effect, right? You would think like universities that are well endowed, like Oxford, Cambridge, and so on, have more money, they can provide better benefits. That makes no difference, right? So it's really kind of this bargaining notion, this cost-benefit notion in terms of providing better maternity benefits. What we also, so we do a few what is called placebo tests. We also look at whether the previous share of male professors has no impact. And what is also interesting, and I thought the real strategical aspect of deciding over maternity benefits comes into play is that when you look at female administrators at childbearing age or senior female administrators, this has no effect on the outcomes. Why is that the case? Of course, it's because, or we argue that's because of what's called in economics skill specificity, right? So a biologist cannot become a political scientist, right? But an administrator who works in a biology department can be replaced by an administrator who works in a political science department. So that's why only the share of female academics at childbearing age actually makes a difference for policy outcomes. So this is basically what we find empirically. So what you have here on the x-axis is the research intensity measured as RAE scores before the last round of changes were implemented in terms of maternity benefits. And then the student-to-staff ratio is kind of a cost argument, right? So what you can see is, on average, more research-intense universities provide better maternity benefits. And on the right-hand side, you have this bargaining argument that universities that had previously a higher share of female professors and previously a higher share of female academics at childbearing age also provide better maternity benefits in terms of generosity. So more weeks with high replacement rates. So what did we do now? So now we kind of know why universities implement different maternity benefits. Now we want to know whether this has an effect on outcomes, right? We could look at aggregated HESA data, so Higher Education Statistical Agency data, and we did that. And there we find correlations that actually support our argument that more generous maternity benefits lead to more female professors and so on. But really, we cannot disentangle whether the generosity of maternity benefits really makes a difference. So what we did is, 2.5 years ago, we devised a large-scale survey that we actually sent out to all female academics in the country. And I will talk about this a little bit more. So we sent out 60,000 emails, right, that were manually web scraped from all the departmental websites. Why did we do that? Because if we had actually gone to the HR departments and asking for email lists or name lists, we would have had to get ethical approval from every single university. But since this is public information on websites, you can just web scrape, but it takes some time. So we surveyed all these 60,000 female academics in January 2017. Our response rate was about 70.5%, so about 10,000 respondents, right? And of course, now you need to know whether the sample was balanced, but I show you some numbers about this. So what we also did, we netted out from the analysis, sometimes we don't know whether Andrea is a man or a woman, these kind of things. So everybody who was male was netted out from the data. People who didn't complete the survey fully, so we also kind of netted out people with adopted children because their maternity is a little bit different. So we will do a follow-up study on this. We will also do a follow-up study on twin parents. So that's also something very interesting. And also women in the sample who did not have yet completed a PhD. So the final sample is then about 7,000 respondents, and 50% of those respondents had at least one child. So that's very nice to actually be able to compare mothers and non-mothers. So we are looking at over 5,000 births in this whole period of time that we are looking at from 1971 to 2017. And we have about 20 single-child mothers. That's interesting because we can analyze single-child mothers more straightforwardly because, of course, as I have shown before, when you have more than one child, generosity is, of course, good, but then you have the countervailing impact of having more frequent breaks in your career. And then we expanded this data. We matched this with higher education statistical agency data, so we have all the characteristics of the institutions. So this is just in terms of what we call a balance analysis to just show how our sample compares to the overall population, so the data we get from the higher education statistical agency. And what you can see is that we oversample professors slightly, which is actually a good thing because it's really difficult to get statistically relevant results on female full professors because there are not so many. And then we also oversample full-time lecturers and full-time academics a little bit. What we do, we use weights to actually make our sample comparable to the HESA sample. So here's just kind of a breakdown of the age distribution in our sample and in the HESA data. And what you can see here is that we also undersample slightly the 26 to 30-year-olds. We first thought when we started the analysis that might be a problem because that's exactly childbearing age. But of course we have retrospective data. So we ask every single woman in the survey about their childbearing history. So we have the childbearing history of every woman. So that doesn't really make a big difference for our analysis. And then we ask women about their income, and here we also slightly oversample the higher income category here. So we asked them all kinds of questions. The survey took about 25 minutes to complete. What I found really interesting is that so many women really were interested in doing this and really filled in the survey. So we have all kinds of personal data on these women. We have data on their current job, their past jobs, so their career paths. So we can actually match the career paths to their childbearing histories. And we asked them about the recent 3 children, when they were born, what kind of facilities were there at the time of birth, what kind of maternity benefits were provided, were offered, and how much did they take. And then we matched that with the institution characteristics at the time of childbirth. So we know where this woman was at the time, at what institution this woman was at the time of childbirth. So we match all the institutional characteristics with that. So I can tell you this took us 2 years to put this data together. So first we are kind of doing some sensibility tests just to see whether this really confirms with what we expect, how maternity uptake and benefits developed over time. And what we see is that clearly uptake of fully paid maternity benefits is correlated with the stage of the career. So as I said before, women wait a little bit longer until they actually have children. We look at the generosity of the higher education institutional maternity provisions that were available. And we also look at the characteristics of the partner of the mother at the time of childbirth, just to see what the incentives were to take longer maternity leave or shorter maternity leave. So this is just to show you that this makes basically sense. Right? So first of all, what we see is that in terms of what was offered, occupational maternity benefits got more generous over time, right? So weeks with full salary replacement, there were still 20% of respondents in the 70s and 80s that said we didn't get any of this, there was none offered, and only 8% in. And that corresponds with the data we collected on the occupational maternity benefits, right? And then also what you can see that mothers over time take more of this fully paid maternity leave. So while you might think academics who were actually academics in the 70s and 80s felt like they had to come back early to go back into, you know, the academic job to be accepted amongst their colleagues and so on, about 85% will take the fully paid part of the leave, okay? So what we find is three main things, right? So getting fully paid leave is really an eligibility point, right? So what happens is that all these occupational maternity packages that we are looking at have eligibility criteria, right? So you have to have been employed for 26 weeks, 52 weeks, sometimes even 104 weeks before you are eligible, right? So women that are higher up in their careers are usually eligible because they don't change jobs so often anymore, right? Remember, imagine you are a postdoc or a young lecturer, then it's much more probable that you change jobs. So if you start a new job, get pregnant, then you're not eligible for the occupational maternity package, right? So eligibility plays a big role in terms of uptake. Also, whether these women consider themselves as primary caretakers or not has a lot to do with uptake. So those who don't have much support will not only take the fully paid portion of the maternity benefit, but also partially paid and unpaid leave. And then, in addition, of course, partner's income plays a role. So women who have a partner with a very high income will also increase the length of the maternity leave taken, right? So they don't only take the fully paid part, so the 6 weeks or 8 weeks that you get fully paid, or 16 weeks here, but they also take some of the partially paid leave, so the leave that is paid at the flat rate. So what we really want to know whether the difference in generosity makes or has an impact on careers. So how do we think about this? It's really, I guess it's really, academia is a really special place, right? It's a very different place from a lot of other sectors. So what happens in academia for most people is that academia is a really flexible kind of work environment. That doesn't mean that you don't have to put the hours in, but it's usually relatively flexible, right? So, which means that it is, of course, possible, even at an early stage, to combine child rearing with your administrative and teaching task. But usually, research is crowded out at that point, right? So it's still possible to take care of your child, to go 2 hours teaching here, 2 hours teaching there, and do your administrative stuff. But research is it's only rewarding in the long term, and so you have to put a lot of effort into research, and that's usually crowded out. Why is this important? It is important because academia is so flexible, what we find is that most women, right, 80% of the women, only take the fully paid part of the leave, right? Because afterwards they can actually go back to full-time work because it's so flexible you can. But what's crowded out then is the research bit, right? And so what happens then is if this fully paid part of the leave is longer, is 26 weeks instead of 8 weeks, right? You have more time to not do teaching and admin and to just at least stay connected to the type of research that's going on in your field. We are not saying you're writing a book while on maternity leave, right? What we are saying is You'll probably keep talking to your co-authors. You probably read a paper here and there, and so on. So what happens is you can hit the ground running when you come back, right, in terms of research. If the fully paid part of the leave is very short, then you have just physically recovered and have to go into admin and teaching, and so research will take a backseat. And that, of course, then should have impacts on outcomes in terms of promotion, income, and so on. So that's the theory. So what we are looking at first is final outcomes, right? So we are looking at current salaries that these women actually earn. And that is the distribution of the current salary, right? So what you can see is that the bulk of women in academia earn between 35 and 65,000 pounds a year. And we want to know whether actually, if you had a child in the past and you had more generous benefits, whether you are on average earning more now. So I will not go into the details of the actual model that we are estimating with this data, but it's kind of a two-stage model where in the first stage we actually, what you have in these policy estimations is that you have treatment, and intention to treat, right? So intention to treat in our case is what was actually offered by the university, and treatment is what the women actually took or were eligible for, right? So what we do in the first stage is just looking at whether the woman took the fully paid part of the leave. And then in the second stage, we analyze whether an additional week of fully paid leave has an effect on final outcomes, in this case, final income. This is the regression table, right? And only if you have never seen a regression table, what's interesting here is the stars. The stars tell you that this is a statistically significant effect, right? So that tells you here that each additional week of fully paid leave will have a 245 pounds addition in outcome, in final salary, right? So that looks a bit like this. So on the y-axis, you have basically the predicted current salary, predicted by the model. And on the x-axis, you have this variable that measures how many weeks of full salary replacement do you get, right? And when you look at this, that's the marginal effect when you go from places that have very ungenerous benefits, so only statutory leave basically, to places like Oxford or Manchester that grant 26 weeks of full salary replacement. You have an increase in final outcomes, so in the final salary, by about 6,000 or 7,000 pounds, right? So 6,000 or 7,000 pounds is between 10 and 20% of the salary distribution, what we have seen. That's a huge effect, right? And so on the right panel, we just show that, of course, maternity benefits is not the only variable that affects outcomes. So for example, if you have enough childcare available and these kind of things, of course, make a difference as well. And a lot of other things make a difference. But if you just look at maternity benefits, then what we see is each additional week of fully paid maternity benefits gives you on average 250 pounds more in your current salary, right? And I think that's something that we need to consider. So what we also find is exactly this mechanism that we are trying to get at, the productivity mechanism, that generosity increases the probability that you actually engage in research activities during your maternity leave. Also, when we look at speed of career progression, then we see that more generous maternity pay increases the probability of becoming a full professor. And we also see that those women who are forced to take unpaid or additional unpaid leave have lower incomes in the end, right? So this is this trade-off that I discussed between length and generosity in the beginning. So we find evidence for this as well in the data. And we also see that those women who are offered more generous maternity benefits have on average a slightly higher job satisfaction. So what do we want to do with this in the future? So there's so much data there. We only just started to analyze the data. But at the moment, we are only analyzing mothers, right? And whether maternity benefit actually makes a difference for their outcomes. What we really want to get at is, of course, as well, what is the motherhood penalty, right? Are there differences in career trajectories between mothers and non-mothers? And in the end, of course, we also want to look at these trajectories as compared to fathers and men in the profession in general. Then we have a lot of data on kind of the workplace environment, so how supportive was the head of department, were we granted additional leave, sabbatical, teaching relief, and so on after maternity. So we are analyzing this data now. And we have web scraped the Web of Science for publication data, and we have just matched the publication data to our survey data, so we can actually look exactly at this mechanism, whether maternity benefits increase or decrease productivity in the medium to long term. And then we need to do a bit more of causal analysis, so tease out the actual effects here. And we can do that by looking at instances where the maternity benefits, the occupational maternity benefits actually changed, right? Because what happens is these maternity benefits change and they were implemented at a specific point in time. So for example, what usually happens is if the maternity benefits change in the year 2010, right, then every child that is born before 1st of April 2010 will receive the old benefits. Every child that is born afterwards will receive the new benefits. So we can actually compare mothers right around this change threshold, right? And the last thing I'm really, really excited about is what we can do is, and I said before, especially young academics move a lot, right? So there will be women who move to an institution who will be just eligible for the new occupational maternity benefits, and others who are just not eligible because they moved a week too early or too late, right? And so we can compare women that fall exactly around this threshold, right? And in this case, we can actually assume that this is random. So they couldn't actually, if you plan to have a child, it's quite difficult to plan at the exact moment when this child is born, right? So that's why we can actually assume quasi-randomness around this threshold and exploit this quasi-randomness to actually look at later outcomes. Just to wrap up, why do we think this is important? Because we are all interested potentially in means-tested policies, right? In the UK, statutory maternity benefits are very low in comparison, so there's room for improvement. If we find that they actually make differences for productivity, career paths, and so on, then potentially by improving also on statutory maternity benefits, that will help to keep female talent in the market, increase productivity, easier career progression to top positions, and potentially in the end help close the salary gap, especially at the top of the salary distribution. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vera. That was fascinating. So much information, so much data. So just to mention the email address on the screen now for anyone who's watching online, if you email a question to that, Lee here in the audience will put up her hand and your question will be given priority since you're off-site. So questions from the floor, please.
Hi. Is this working? Yeah. So first, one clarification and apologies. It's my second day back from maternity leave, so I do make several mistakes. We do only get 8 weeks of full pay maternity and 16 with added benefits. what I wanted to say was, how do you think the effect of shared parental leave will have on all of this? And how is this also relevant to other, for engineering, for example, non-academic careers?
Thank you for the question. So as it happens, I'm working with the BEIS, the Labor Market Directorate, on the shared parental leave policy. And so it's relatively hard to say with this data what will happen, but they are doing the shared parental leave survey at the moment, so we will get data on uptake of shared parental leaves. So what we know from other countries, for example, Sweden, is that it took a while to implement this and to make fathers actually take a substantive proportion of the parental leave. But it has insofar generates good outcomes for children, especially. So it's not so clear, but so it's clear that it generates good outcomes for children later in terms of education and so on. But what we see from the Swedish data as well is that it also has effects on mothers in the workplace, because it's not so, parental leave is not considered to be a women's thing anymore, right? And if fathers go on parental leave and then take a substantive proportion of time out and then also have to come back and deal with all the problems that you face when you left the workplace for 6 months or even for 3 months and then come back and have to catch up on things and so on. So it becomes much more accepted in society, and once it becomes more accepted, that of course also helps women's career progression, because they are not considered anymore, that they are not so committed to the job anymore because they took time out or they reduced hours afterwards and so on. It's kind of, it changes the culture around parental leave. And I think that is really important, but it's a long-term process. Because there's a counterexample to this, Germany, where shared parental leave was also introduced many years ago, not many years ago, maybe 10 years ago or something. And what we find there is what is called a corner solution. So what happens there is you get either 12 months or 40 months of paid parental leave. You get 40 months if the partner, the father, takes at least 2 months. What happens is fathers take exactly 2 months, right? And so this shifts slightly the cultural aspect of it, but only very slightly, because if a father decides to take more than 2 months, they are looked at as if they are, what the hell are you doing, right? So I think the Swedish case is really good, but Sweden already had a more equal culture to begin with, right? So it depends a little bit. So the hope really is that it will change the culture and how especially employers and colleagues look at parental leave, that it's a joint thing, right? That everybody should take it, should be involved in child rearing and so on. So that's the one thing. The other thing is, that's a very good question. So that's basically a question of external validity of our research here, right? Can we draw conclusions from this for other sectors? What we believe and what our qualitative evidence shows is that in most high-skilled sectors, this might have similar effects, because it's really about just getting time to breathe and letting your brain recover and so on after childbirth, and keeping in touch what's going on in your area. And whether this is in academia or whether this is in, when you are a car designer or an engineer, should potentially not make such a big difference, but that is really something we need to look into. So that's why we are also commissioned now to do the same or a similar study for other sectors. The problem here really is that it will be very difficult to collect productivity data in other sectors. So that's the one benefit about analyzing academia. One thing we thought, for example, in academia, is that not all disciplines are the same, right? So if you are in, say, in the natural sciences, in biology or chemistry or something like that, where you have to be in the lab, then staying away for longer might not be very beneficial. And so we looked at it across disciplines, but it makes no difference. So So it seems like generosity is really beneficial.
Thank you very much, Vera. That was fascinating. Makes me reflect on my own bad choices of having twins, September-born twins, the year before the maternity leave pay got more generous in the UK. But hey-ho. I've got 2 questions which relate to LSTM. So it's interesting to see how we rate with the 8 weeks. So relatively less generous than others. We are very research active, looking at the indicators of what determines generosity, and really interesting to see how important that is in terms of addressing the gender pay gap. Sadly, we have less than 10 women professors, though, so I'm interested also to see have you talked to universities around the decisions that they make and what drives that? Would love to hear more about that. And then the other thing, I think, in terms of LSTM, to be research active, it so often involves travel. So for me, with baby twins, I'm not even allowed on the plane on my own, right? Because you have to have a one-to-one adult. So
I wasn't even aware, yes.
But how do we support new mums to travel if they're still breastfeeding? And so in other universities like the Institute of Development Studies, they have a system whereby if you do consultancy, you have to donate a proportion of that to a pot, which parents can then apply to if they've got caring responsibilities. So I think these issues are particularly pertinent for us sitting in tropical medicine. So I was wondering whether you had any reflections or good practice on that. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Great questions. So yes, because the first thing, we were always interested in outcomes, and then we saw this large variation, so we thought, okay, that needs to be explained. So the first thing we did is we went from university to university to university and talked to HR officials to find out what happens, what is the process around changing maternity benefits, right? And so, so what they tell us is usually, and that's what we put in the bargaining model in the end, right? So what they tell us usually, this is triggered by something, right? Thinking about maternity benefits is triggered by something. At the moment, it's triggered by Athena-Swan, right? So in all universities, you have the Athena-Swan processes going on. And so, for example, in Warwick, it was like I went to HR and said, look, we need to do something about maternity benefits because I was the Athena-Swan responsible person in economics. Of course, I'm the one female economic professor. So and then these HR officials said, and then usually what they do is research in terms of focus groups, right? So they actually talk to stakeholders. So they talk to parents, they talk to female academics, female professors to give input. They even run surveys sometimes about this when they want to change maternity benefits. Then they usually have an economist do a cost-benefit analysis, right? Which they can't unless they have this type of data, right? Because you need a general equilibrium model, because it might just be, if productivity is increased by this, that in the long run, this pays for itself, right? And then they also do this peer group evaluation, right? They look at what do other places that we want to compete with or we think we are similar to have in terms of maternity benefits, right? And I have a very funny anecdote about this, because when we first published this paper, I got a call from the HR director from the University of Exeter saying, oh, because it came out in The Guardian, right? So you're naming and shaming us and so on. And I'm like, well, yes, that was the purpose of this, right? And so the next thing they do, and that was really, really great, the next thing they do is they change their maternity benefits from the lowest in the Russell group to the highest in the Russell group. No eligibility criteria, 26 weeks of full pay, right? So I just thought, if that is the kind of impact this kind of research can have, then I'm very happy, right? So sometimes research triggers these processes as well. But it's kind of the HR really thinks in terms of cost benefit and peer group pressure and competition in that sense. Then the other question about traveling, that's kind of a more child care issue, right? So So I think institutions, as you say, should have a responsibility for this as well. I'm working with a lot of associations that organize conferences, right? Like the European Political Science Association, the American Political Science Association. And what we are trying to do is provide travel grants, right? And childcare facilities at the conferences, right? That parents can, they can then go to their panel or to their presentation and just leave the children in a childcare facility that is paid for by the conference organizer. These kind of things, I think, are super important. But this is a multidimensional problem, right? So conferences, conference organizers, people who invite people to give talks have to actually think about these kind of things. And institutions have to support their female researchers to do this, right? Or parents in general. Also, sometimes the fathers have to travel with the children as well. And I'm not completely sure whether I like the idea of somebody who does consultancy having to pay money into a pot. I mean, I like the idea that somebody thinks about how to finance this, but I think that should be an institutional responsibility, right? The institution needs to invest in their productive mothers, right? And they want to keep up productivity. So going to conferences, getting feedback, giving talks is part of this research process, right? And without that, you might actually produce, less successful research or get less input. And I think, that should be part, for example, of Sina Swan proposals. You have to generate these action plans, right? One of the actions is lobby the university leadership to have these funds available for young mothers, right?
In this case, that is an institutional policy, but that's how they fund it.
Yeah. Right, but the institution has income from all kinds of different things and should just finance this, right? Yeah.
Oh dear. Are you okay? So great talk, and thank you very much for that. So I speak as a father of grown-up children, and I reflect back to a time when statutory parental leave for fathers was 2 weeks, full stop. And I remember that being really difficult. I hated it, I have to be honest. I found it really hard. And it made me reflect on one of your pieces of information, which was that the impact of fathers or partner involvement didn't seem to have any
no, huge. It has a huge impact.
Oh, it did have.
Yeah.
Oh, so I misread that.
Yeah.
But I wanted to understand how you measured that, because I imagine that's a really difficult thing. You ask somebody how much your partner was involved or not involved. That's a difficult question.
It's potentially biased, yeah.
Yeah, but it also made me think about some of your other information. For example, it sounds easy that we can attribute publication output, but publication output is increasingly a team effort. So how do you attribute? So I'd just be interested in how you've dealt with that, what you've learnt about that, and what you might do with that information for future, especially when we now come to look at shared parental leave, which I think like, hallelujah, finally it's there. And I watch some of my junior colleagues taking that up and really wanting to support that. So I'd be interested in those things.
Yeah, no, also very good questions. So yes, and this 2 weeks, that has been in place for a very, very long time. Only recently that has been changed, right? So fathers indeed only got 2 weeks of paid leave after a child was born. I think shared parental leave is really, really important, not just for fathers personally, but indeed to foster cultural change in this area, right? So that it makes it more acceptable to stay at home, and we look at children as being kind of a public good, right? These are the next generation who pays the pensions for people are getting old now and so on. So that's just an important thing to think about a cultural change as well, I think. So one of the things I said is that actually having children is actually positive for fathers, right? That is something you picked up on. And that is an average effect, and this average effect actually comes from those couples where the man is an academic with a stay-at-home wife, right? That's the major effect that we see there, right? In academic couples, usually the bargaining goes a little bit differently, and so their really partner involvement is really more important. So how we measure partner involvement, and as you say, right now we really asked, or we have asked the women in the survey, how much was your partner involved in the first 2 years of child rearing, and then they can give us a percentage, like 5, 10, 20, 50%, right? However this might be biased, and however women might have very different views on this, what we see is even with this measure that those women who say that their partners were very much involved in the first couple of years of after the child being born have better outcomes, right? So even though this might be a very noisy and not a very good measure, it actually points in the direction we would expect, right? So in these cases where partners are more involved, women have better outcomes, they produce more, and so on. So the last question about this joint effort in terms of publication, that's a very good question, because what we are now doing is actually we are analyzing co-authors' networks around childbirth, right? And I think that will get at your question. So we have just gotten the data, and we will see what we find, so whether actually women who had really tight co-author networks before having a child fared better afterwards, right? Or people who mostly published by themselves have a bigger dip. That could be, right? So that kind of is something we might expect, but that is something we will be able to analyze. I have no answers for you yet, just speculations, but there will be data-based empirical answers to this.
Yes.
It's just because I've got people on Twitter raising something and I don't think they've managed to get an email through. I think this has all been really fascinating, thank you, and really thought-provoking. It's maybe partly accounted for by the look at eligibility thresholds, but have you looked at any other way at the impact of insecure fixed-term contracts on this whole area, because it's an issue that's of particular concern to us as a research-funded institution?
Absolutely, yeah. That's a really fascinating question, because what you could expect, for example, is that institutions who provide better maternity benefits have a higher incentive to hire more women on these precarious fixed-term contracts. And unfortunately, this is exactly what we find, right? So not so much in the high echelon of research-intense places, that's much less the case, but especially in those places that are a bit more teaching-oriented, the ex-polytechniques and so on. If these, by some, whatever the process was, provide relatively generous maternity benefits, they tend to hire more women on fixed-term contracts, because in that case, these women are usually not eligible for the OMPs, for the occupational maternity pay, because these contracts are year-long, right? And then eligibility is exactly 52 weeks. You have to be employed for 52 weeks before the 15th week of expected childbirth. Yeah. Yeah, it is, right? And the funny thing is, of course, you asked people about this. You asked HR and managers and so and people who are actually involved in hiring people, and of course, they are not. It's interesting. Either they are not really aware of this, right? Or of course they are aware but don't want to say, because that, of course, would constitute discrimination, right? So, but what we find empirically is exactly that, so that those institutions with better maternity pay, unfortunately, hire more women on precarious contracts.
Okay, we have one last question from, is that from, right, sorry Bertie, you have to be usurped from someone who's, and then, but just to say that Vera will be in the social space from 3 o'clock, so please come and chat with her. I think it's been really thought-provoking, and for me, if I may, because I have I mean, there's so many parallels with what we do empirically with our epidemiological data that it's helped with my imposter syndrome. It's like, oh my gosh, yeah, we do this stuff. We definitely do this stuff. So that's wonderful. And I think there's lots of parallels with our work, our research work, not just our institutional policies. So please, the
Hello,
question.
Vera. This is from an overseas person, Eleanor McPherson, and she's also asking a question about the insecurity of contracts. And she said, while research-intensive institutions are more generous, women still face huge insecurities around contracts, and how would this affect progression?
So I think there are two answers to this. One is a lot of women in especially high research intense institutions are very strategic about the timing of childbirth, right? So in the survey we did is a lot of women who had children, especially at Russell Group universities, basically said we waited until we had a permanent contract, right? Quite often that is not possible because the childbearing period might not actually overlap with having a permanent contract. And so in these cases, what we find, it's really detrimental, right? So having a child on a probationary contract or on a precarious contract, when you do not get enough support from the institution through maternity benefits and other kind of institutional childcare and so on, then this will lower your career trajectory tremendously. Yeah.
Excellent. And thank you, everyone, and thanks again to Vera for making the trip up to Liverpool. And I feel like I've found my sister from a different mother here, so that's especially nice for me. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming.
Thank you very much for your questions.